This is a work of historical fiction inspired by real building techniques and weather events of the 1880s American frontier. In the brutal winter of 1889, a 5-day ice storm swept through southern Minnesota. When it ended, only one building in Cottonwood County stood untouched, and it had been built by 2 orphans the whole town called fools. This is their story. The train from Chicago pulled into Walnut Grove Station on the 17th of September, and Becket Whitmore stepped down onto the platform with everything he owned in 2 canvas bags and a dog at his heels. He was 21 years old. His hands were stained with printer's ink that never quite washed out, and his coat was too thin for where he was going. Behind him, his sister Linnea climbed down more carefully, holding the iron railing with both hands. Her wool shawl pulled tight against the prairie wind. She was 18. She had their mother's auburn hair pinned up in a style that had taken her an hour that morning on the rocking train, and their father's gray eyes that seemed to see through things rather than at them. In her coat pocket was a letter from a lawyer in St. Paul, folded so many times the creases had begun to tear. Their uncle Elias Whitmore, unmarried and childless, had died in his sleep the previous spring in a boarding house in Mankato. He had left everything he owned to the niece and nephew he had met exactly 3 times in their lives. Everything he owned was 80 acres of prairie grass and a burned-out trading post that had once been the only supply station for 40 miles in any direction. The dog was named Copper. He was 3 years old, a hunting hound with a coat the color of old pennies, and Becket had found him tied to a post behind the Chicago rail yards 2 years earlier, ribs showing through his fur, too weak to bark. Now Copper pressed against Beckett's leg and watched the new platform with ears forward, alert to everything. They had $127 saved between them. Becket had earned his share in 4 years of setting type at the Chicago Tribune, 12 hours a day, 6 days a week, breathing lead dust and washing his hands in kerosene. Linnea had earned hers sewing dresses for women who never learned her name, women who stood on platforms while she knelt at their hems and pinned fabric that cost more than she made in a month. They had no parents. Their father had died of typhoid fever in the summer of 1883, and their mother had followed him 7 weeks later. Not from typhoid, but from something the doctors had no name for. Something that made her stop eating and stop speaking, and finally stop breathing in her sleep. Becket had been 15. Linnea had been 12. They had raised each other in a 1-room apartment above a butcher shop on the south side of Chicago, taking turns working and taking turns making sure the other one ate. They had come west on the letter alone. The trading post stood alone under an enormous sky. From a quarter-mile off, walking the dirt track that the wagon driver would not take them any further on, Becket could see the stone foundation rising 3 full feet above the grass, solid and square and untouched. The foundation was granite, quarried from somewhere Becket did not know, and it had been laid with such precision that the corners were still true after 30 years of prairie winters. Above the foundation, the oak timber framing still held. It was blackened from fire, stripped of paint, the surfaces charred into patterns that looked like dragon scales. But the main posts and the long overhead trusses kept their shape the way bones hold a body together even after everything else is gone. The chimney rose nearly 25 feet from the north gable, every stone still in place. It was built from the same granite as the foundation, and the mortar between the stones was still tight. Becket touched it with his hand and felt the cold of the stone seep into his palm. Only the roof had failed. Half the cedar shakes were gone entirely, and what remained sagged like wet cloth between the rafters. The fire had started there, Becket guessed. Lightning, maybe, or something else. There was no door in the doorframe and no glass in any of the window holes. The wind went through the building without stopping, carrying the smell of char and old rain and something underneath that might have been the ghost of wood smoke. Linnea stood in what had once been the main room and turned in a slow circle, looking up at the blackened trusses and the patches of sky showing through the ruined roof. Copper sniffed at the corners, then came back to Beckett and sat down beside him, waiting. The nearest town was Millbrook, a string of 17 buildings along a creek 6 miles north. The lawyer's letter said there was a general store there, a blacksmith, a church, and a doctor. It said the land had been surveyed and the deed was clear. It said nothing about why Uncle Elias had died alone in a boarding house 60 miles from the property he had spent 20 years building. They slept that first night on the granite floor of the trading post with their bedrolls spread between 2 foundation stones and their coats pulled up to their chins. The wind went through the empty window holes all night and made a low breathing sound in the blackened rafters, a sound that was almost like words if you listened too hard. Copper slept between them with his head on Beckett's ankle and his body curled against Linnea's side, warming them both. Beckett woke once in the deepest part of the night and lay still, looking up at the stars through the holes in the roof. The Milky Way spread across the sky like spilled flour, brighter than he had ever seen it in Chicago, brighter than he had known stars could be. For a moment he felt how small he was, how small they both were, 2 specks of warmth on 80 acres of grass under a sky that went on forever. Then Copper sighed in his sleep and pressed closer, and Beckett closed his eyes and slept until the first gray light of dawn. The man who rode up the track at noon the next day was not old, but he carried himself like someone who had stopped expecting good news a long time ago. He sat a big bay gelding with an easy authority, and he dismounted without being asked and walked the foundation line with his hands clasped behind his back, studying the blackened timbers the way a buyer studies livestock. His name was Warren Aldridge. He was 55 years old, with a gray-streaked black beard trimmed close to his jaw and eyes that had settled into permanent calculation. He owned the lumber mill 8 miles south, the largest operation in the county, and he had been trying to buy the trading post section for 3 years. $75 for the 80 acres, he said. Cash. Today. You take your bags back to Chicago, and I will have a crew out here by Friday to pull the frame down. Hecate stood with his hands at his sides and said nothing. Aldridge waited. When no answer came, he tilted his head slightly, the way a man does when he is not sure he has been understood. The trading post is dead, he said. Your uncle knew it, and that is why he let it rot. There is no money in a supply station anymore. The railroad killed that business 20 years ago. What there is money in is timber, and this section sits on the only road wide enough to haul logs from my mill to the lake. Every day I have to go around your property costs me time and money. $75 is generous. No, thank you, Linnea said. Aldridge looked at her for the first time. He had not considered her worth addressing until that moment, and something shifted in his eyes, a recalculation. You are children, he said. You do not understand what winter means here. You do not understand what it means to be 6 miles from the nearest help when the temperature drops to 40 below and the snow comes sideways for a week straight. You do not understand what your uncle understood at the end, which is why he left this place and died in a warm bed in Mankato instead of frozen solid on his own floor. Linnea did not look away from him. We understand enough, she said. No, thank you, Mr. Aldridge. Warren Aldridge looked at her the way a man looks at a fence he intends to come back and cut. Then he mounted his horse and rode south without another word. Beckett watched the dust of his horse fade into the copper-colored grass and felt something heavy settle in his chest. He did not know yet what Aldridge was capable of. He did not know what the man had done 3 years earlier, or what he was willing to do again. He only knew that he and Linnea were alone on 80 acres of prairie with a ruined building and $127 and a dog, and that winter was coming. That afternoon, Linnea found the box. She had been exploring the foundation, running her hands along the granite blocks, looking for any crack or weakness that might tell her how the building had failed. In the northeast corner, where the chimney met the foundation, she found a stone that moved. It was not loose from age or damage. It was set on a hinge, a clever hidden mechanism that allowed it to swing open like a tiny door. Behind it was a hollow space in the foundation wall, and inside that space was a metal box the size of a loaf of bread. The box was locked, but the lock was cheap, and Beckett broke it open with the back of his belt knife. Inside was a leather journal, water-stained but legible. Inside was a folded set of drawings on engineer's paper, precise and detailed. Inside was a letter that had never been sent, addressed to Beckett and Linnea Whitmore, Chicago, Illinois. The letter was dated March 14, 1889, 6 days before Uncle Elias died. If you are reading this, then something has happened to me, and the lawyers have done what I asked them to do. I am sorry we did not know each other better. I am sorry I was not there when your parents passed. I am sorry for many things. The trading post burned 3 years ago. I was not here when it happened. I was in Mankato buying supplies, and when I came back, the roof was gone and the walls were black, and everything I had built in 20 years was smoke and char. They said it was lightning. The sheriff said it was lightning. But there had been no storm that night, and I found coal oil on the stones by the east window, and I knew. Warren Aldridge had been trying to buy this land for 2 years. I refused him every time. I refused him because this land is mine, because I built something here with my own hands, because a man does not sell his life's work to someone who sees it only as an obstacle. I think he burned it to drive me out. I cannot prove it. But I know. I did not rebuild. I did not have the strength anymore. But I did not sell either, and I never will. This land goes to you, and what you do with it is your choice. If you choose to stay, if you choose to rebuild, there is a man you must find. His name is Silas Brennan. He lives in a cabin by the lake, 8 miles northeast of Millbrook. He is the best builder I ever knew. He taught me things about construction that no one in this country remembers anymore. Old techniques from the Germans and the Swedes and the people who lived through winters that would kill everyone in Minnesota. Find Silas. He will help you. He will show you how to build something that cannot be burned down, cannot be frozen out, cannot be broken by any storm this prairie can throw. I should have done it myself. I should have rebuilt stronger. But I was tired, and I was angry, and I let Aldridge win without ever admitting it. Do not let him win again. Your uncle, Elias Linnea, read the letter twice, and then she handed it to Beckett and watched his face while he read it. Copper sat at her feet, watching both of them with his amber eyes, patient and still. When Beckett finished, he folded the letter carefully and put it back in the box. Then he picked up the journal and began to turn the pages. Uncle Elias had been an engineer before he came west. He had worked on bridges and roads and buildings in Pennsylvania and Ohio, and he had kept notes on everything he learned. The journal was full of sketches and calculations, cross-sections of walls and foundations and roof structures, notes on materials and methods that Beckett had never heard of. One section was marked with a ribbon, It was titled, in Uncle Elias's careful handwriting, Double Wall Construction, Straw Slip Method, learned from S. Brennan, 1884. The drawings showed a wall built in 2 layers, an outer frame and an inner frame with a gap of 10 inches between them. Into that gap, according to the notes, you packed a mixture of wet clay and chopped straw until it was solid. When it dried, the note said, it was light as bread and held heat like a stone oven. A building within a building, the note said. The outer wall takes the wind. The inner wall holds the warmth. The space between them is dead air, and dead air is the best insulation God ever made. Beckett closed the journal and looked up at the blackened timbers of the trading post. The outer frame was still standing. The outer frame was still strong. All they needed to do was build the inner wall. Beckett and Linnea have inherited more than land. They have inherited their uncle's unfinished fight and the secret knowledge that might save their lives. But first, they must find the one man who can teach them what the journal cannot. Stay with us. Silas Brennan lived in a 1-room cabin on the northeast shore of the lake, 8 miles from Millbrook by the wagon road, and 5 miles if you knew the trails. He was 68 years old, with a silver-white beard trimmed close to his jaw and hands that were still steady despite the years. He had built 14 railroad bridges in his life, from Minnesota to the Missouri line, and he had retired to this cabin 12 years ago when his wife passed, and the work stopped meaning anything. Beckett found him on the 3rd day, after asking in Millbrook and being pointed toward the lake by a woman at the general store, who said Silas did not like visitors, but might make an exception for someone connected to Elias Whitmore. The old man was sitting on a stump outside his cabin, whittling a piece of cedar into a shape that might have been a bird or might have been nothing at all. He did not look up when Beckett approached, and he did not speak. Beckett stood at the edge of the clearing and waited. Copper sat down beside him, patient. After a long time, Silas held up the piece of cedar and studied it against the light. Elias Whitmore's nephew, he said. I heard you were coming. I heard you found the box. Yes, sir. Silas set down the cedar and the knife, and finally looked at Beckett. His eyes were pale blue, almost colorless, and they seemed to look through things rather than at them. Your uncle was a good man, Silas said. He was stubborn and proud, and he made mistakes, but he was a good man. I taught him everything I knew about building, and he was a fast learner, faster than most. He stood up slowly, the way old men stand when their joints have stopped cooperating with their intentions. Come inside, he said. I will make coffee, and you will tell me what you want. The cabin was small, but perfectly built. The walls were tight. The corners were true. And there was a warmth to the air inside that seemed to exist independently of the fire in the small iron stove. Beckett noticed the walls were thicker than they should have been, much thicker, and when he looked closely, he could see that they were built in 2 layers with a gap between. You see it, Silas said. He poured coffee from a battered tin pot into 2 cups and handed one to Beckett. Good. Most people walk into this cabin and feel the warmth and never think about where it comes from. You looked at the walls. My uncle's journal mentioned a technique, double walls, straw and clay. Silas sat down across from him and wrapped his hands around his cup. Straw slip, he said. That is what the Germans call it. Leichtlehm. Light loam. I learned it from a man named Heinrich Brenner in Pennsylvania 50 years ago. He learned it from his father, and his father learned it from builders in the Rhineland, who had been doing it for 500 years. He took a sip of his coffee. The principle is simple. You mix wet clay with chopped straw until the straw is coated but not drowned. Then you pack it into the space between your inner wall and your outer wall, and you tamp it down firm. When it dries, it becomes something remarkable. It is light enough that it does not stress the structure. It is dense enough that air cannot pass through it. And it holds heat the way stone holds heat, slow to warm and slow to cool. He gestured at the walls of his cabin. It is October outside. It was 28 degrees this morning. I have not added wood to that stove in 4 hours, and the air in here is still warm. That is straw slip. That is the old knowledge. The knowledge people forgot when they started building cheap and fast instead of building right. Beckett set down his cup. I want to rebuild the trading post, he said. I want to use this technique. Will you teach me? Silas was quiet for a long moment. He looked at Beckett, and then he looked past him, out the window, at the trees and the lake and the sky beyond. Your uncle asked me the same thing, he said, after the fire. He came to this cabin and asked me to help him rebuild, and I said yes. But he never came back. He never started the work. Something broke in him when that building burned, and he could not find the strength to fix it. He looked back at Beckett. You are young, he said. You are strong, but you are also ignorant, and this work will break your hands and your back before it is done. Why should I teach you? Beckett thought about the question. He thought about his parents, dying in that apartment in Chicago. He thought about Linnea, kneeling at the hems of rich women's dresses. He thought about Uncle Elias, writing that letter in a boarding house in Mankato, knowing he was dying, hoping his words would reach someone who could finish what he could not. Because my uncle believed I could do it, Beckett said. And because I will not let Warren Aldridge win. Silas smiled. It was a small smile, barely a movement of his lips, but it changed his whole face. Good answer, he said. Be at the trading post tomorrow at first light. Bring every dollar you can spare to the store in Millbrook. You are going to need them. Beckett spent 41 of their $127 at the general store in Millbrook the next day. He bought nails by the keg, cedar boards by the wagon load, 2 barrels of slaked lime, 8 pounds of hemp rope, 6 boxes of window glass, and 100 small things he did not know he needed until the woman behind the counter put them in his hands. Her name was Dorothea Marsh. She was 45 years old, a widow with honey blonde hair going gray at the temples and green eyes that did not blink enough. Her husband had died in a logging accident 3 years ago, and she had run the store alone ever since, raising her 16-year-old son Tobias and keeping the books and doing the work of 2 people because there was no one else to do it. She looked at the list Beckett handed her, and then she looked at him. You are Elias Whitmore's nephew, she said. Yes, ma'am. She began pulling items from the shelves, moving with the efficiency of someone who knew exactly where everything was. I knew your uncle, she said. He used to come in every month for supplies. He was a quiet man, polite. He always asked about Tobias, even when Tobias was just a baby. She set a box of nails on the counter. When the trading post burned, he stopped coming. I did not see him again for a year, and when I did, he looked like a man who had given up on something important. She met Beckett's eyes. I hope you do not give up, she said. I hope you finish what he could not. Beckett did not know what to say to that, so he said nothing. He paid for his supplies and loaded them into the wagon Dorothea let him borrow, and he drove back to the trading post with Copper sitting beside him on the seat. Silas was waiting when he arrived. That night, while Linnea slept and Silas had gone back to his cabin, Beckett sat alone by the small fire they had built inside the foundation walls. The stars were bright overhead, visible through the ruined roof, and the wind made its breathing sound in the blackened rafters. He had his uncle's journal open on his knees, but he was not reading it. He was thinking about Chicago, about the apartment above the butcher shop, about the smell of blood that seeped up through the floorboards no matter how much they scrubbed. He was thinking about Linnea, 12 years old, and trying to make dinner for them both while their mother lay in bed and stared at the ceiling and waited to die. He was thinking about how easy it would be to take Aldridge's money and go back, $75, plus the $86 they had left. That was enough to start over somewhere else, somewhere with paved streets and indoor plumbing and jobs that did not require digging clay from a frozen creek bed. He picked up a piece of scrap paper and began to write. Mr. Aldridge, I have reconsidered your offer. If you are still willing to pay $75 for the property, I am willing to sell. Please send word to the trading post at your earliest convenience. Beckett Whitmore. He read the words back to himself. They looked reasonable. They looked like the words of a man making a sensible decision. He folded the letter and put it in his pocket. He would send it in the morning. Linnea found the letter before sunrise. She had woken early, as she always did, and she had gone looking for Beckett to ask him something about the work they had planned for that day. Instead, she found the folded paper on the ground beside his bedroll, where it had fallen from his coat pocket during the night. She read it by the gray light of dawn, and then she read it again. Then she walked to where Beckett was sleeping and stood over him until he opened his eyes. "What is this?" she said. Her voice was quiet. That was how Beckett knew she was truly angry. When Linnea shouted, it meant she was frustrated or impatient or annoyed. When she spoke quietly, it meant something deeper. He sat up and rubbed his face. "It is nothing," he said. "I was just thinking." "You were thinking about selling. I was thinking about whether we can actually do this, whether we are just fooling ourselves, whether Uncle Elias was right to give up." Linnea held up the letter. "Uncle Elias did not give up," she said. "He gave up on rebuilding, but he did not give up on this land. He kept it. He held on to it for 3 more years, even though it cost him everything, even though it probably killed him. And then he gave it to us because he believed we would finish what he could not." She tore the letter in half. Then she tore it again and again, until the pieces were too small to tear anymore. She let them fall to the ground like snow. "If you sell this land," she said, "you sell everything. You sell the memory of our parents. You sell the hope of our uncle. You sell any chance we have of building something that belongs to us, something no one can take away." Her gray eyes were bright with something that might have been tears or might have been rage. "I did not come 1,000 miles to give up in the first week," she said. "I did not spend 6 years watching you work yourself half to death so we could have enough money to do exactly what everyone expected us to do. We are not those people, Beckett. We are not the people who give up." She turned and walked toward the creek, where the clay waited to be dug. "Are you coming?" she said without looking back. "Or do I have to do this alone?" Beckett looked at the torn pieces of the letter scattered on the ground. He looked at his sister, walking away from him with her shoulders set and her head high. He looked at Copper, who was watching him with amber eyes that seemed to understand more than any dog should understand. Then he got up and followed her. The doubts were silenced, at least for now. But harder tests were coming. The skeptics of Millbrook had begun to notice the strange construction taking place on the Whitmore property, and they had opinions. Strong opinions. Stay with us. The work began in earnest. Every morning at first light, Silas appeared at the trading post with his tools wrapped in oiled canvas, a plumb line, a carpenter's level worn smooth at its edges, a German framing square his father had brought across the ocean 60 years earlier. He worked alongside Beckett and Linnea without complaint, adjusting their mistakes, correcting their technique, teaching them the old ways, one board and one nail at a time. The clay came from the bed of the creek that ran through the southeast corner of the property. It was dense and red-brown, heavy with minerals, and digging it was backbreaking work. Beckett dug for 6 hours that first day and filled half a wagon. His hands blistered through his gloves, and his shoulders ached in ways he had not known shoulders could ache. Linnea worked beside him. She had insisted, and when Beckett tried to argue, she had picked up a shovel and started digging without looking at him. By the end of the first day, her palms were raw and bleeding, and she wrapped them in strips torn from her petticoat and kept working. Copper watched them from the shade of a cottonwood tree, his head on his paws, his amber eyes following their movements back and forth, as steady as a metronome. The straw came from a farmer named Magnus Lindgren, who lived 3 miles west and had more wheat straw than he knew what to do with. He brought it in a wagon the third day, 400 pounds of it, and he stayed to watch Beckett and Silas begin the mixing. "My grandmother used to talk about this," he said. He was 48 years old, a Swede with pale blue eyes and forearms like fence posts. She called it lerväg, mud walls. She said her father's house in Småland was built this way, and it was warm when everything else was cold. He looked at the trading post, at the blackened frame and the new cedar boards stacked beside the foundation. "I thought it was just a story," he said, "something old people said to pass the time." Silas smiled. "The old stories are usually true," he said. "That is why they survive." By the end of the first week, word had gone around Millbrook that the Whitmore children meant to stay. Most of the people who came out to look were kind enough in their faces and quiet about what they thought. They stood at the edge of the property and watched Beckett and Linnea and Silas mixing clay and straw in a long wooden trough, stirring with hose until the mixture reached the consistency Silas kept saying it ought to be. "Thick enough to hold a hoe upright," he said. "Wet enough to pack without crumbling." They watched and they whispered, and then they went home to their own houses and shook their heads and said things that were not kind at all. The skeptics came one after another, like crows drawn to a field where something was dying. Dr. Horace Bellamy rode out on a Tuesday afternoon. He was 48 years old, thin and precise, with spectacles that he adjusted constantly and a medical bag that he carried everywhere even when he had no patients to see. He had studied medicine in Philadelphia and surgery in Boston, and he had come to Minnesota because his wife's family owned land here, and because he believed the frontier needed educated men. He walked the perimeter of the building site without being invited, and he studied the mixture in the trough with the same expression he might use to examine an infected wound. "Clay walls," he said. He adjusted his spectacles. "There is no scientific basis for this. Clay absorbs moisture. When moisture freezes, it expands. When it expands, it cracks. Your walls will be rubble by Christmas." Silas did not stop stirring. "The straw changes the behavior of the clay," he said. "The fibers create air pockets. The air pockets prevent moisture accumulation. The mixture dries from the inside out." Dr. Bellamy made a sound that was not quite a laugh. "Folk wisdom," he said. "I have seen folk wisdom kill more patients than disease ever did." Silas finally looked up at him. "And I have seen educated men freeze to death in houses they built wrong," he said. "Come back in January. We will see whose wisdom holds." Bellamy adjusted his spectacles one more time and walked away without another word. Reverend Josiah Crane arrived on the second Sunday of October. He was 52 years old, tall and lean with silver hair swept back from a high forehead and a voice that could fill his small wooden church without effort. He walked the foundation line with his hands clasped behind his back and his Bible tucked under his arm, and he watched Linnea packing straw slip into the wall cavity with an expression of deep concern. "Miss Whitmore," he said, "I must ask you a question." Linnea did not stop working. "Yes, Reverend. Where does this knowledge come from?" She paused then, just for a moment, and looked at him. "From Germany," she said. "From Sweden. From people who survived winters harder than this one for hundreds of years." Crane nodded slowly, as if she had confirmed something he already suspected. "Not from Scripture," he said. "No, Reverend, not from Scripture." He was quiet for a long moment, watching her hands move, watching the mixture of clay and straw fill the space between the walls. "I worry for your souls," he said finally. "I worry that you have placed your faith in pagan knowledge, in the wisdom of men who did not know God, and that when the test comes, that knowledge will fail you." Linnea tamped down the straw slip with her mallet and reached for another handful. "When the test comes," she said, "we will see." Marcus Thorne came the following Tuesday. He was 35, the youngest bank manager in the county's history, with pomaded hair and a gold watch chain and soft hands that had never known a day of physical labor. He did not dismount from his horse. He simply sat in his saddle and looked down at Beckett with the expression of a man explaining arithmetic to a slow child. "I understand you applied for a construction loan," he said. Beckett had been to the bank in Millbrook the previous week, asking for $50 to buy additional lumber. The clerk had taken his application and said someone would be in touch. "I did," Beckett said. Thorne smiled. It was not a friendly smile. "I am afraid we cannot approve that loan," he said. "The collateral is insufficient. The property has no income-generating potential, and the construction method you have described is, to put it charitably, unproven." He leaned forward slightly in his saddle. "I do not lend money to build graves, Mr. Whitmore. I suggest you reconsider Mr. Aldridge's offer while it is still on the table." He turned his horse and rode away without waiting for a response. Harlan Garrett came with 3 friends on a Saturday afternoon, when Beckett and Linnea were mixing clay by the creek. He was 19 years old, the son of the man who ran the feed store in Millbrook, and he had the kind of confidence that comes from never having been seriously tested by anything. He stood on the bank above them with his arms crossed and his friends snickering behind him. "I heard you were building a house out of mud," he called down. I did not believe it until I saw it with my own eyes. Beckett kept stirring. "My friends and I have a bet going," Harlan continued. "I say your walls crack before Thanksgiving. Billy here says Christmas. We have $5 riding on it." One of his friends laughed, a high, mean sound that echoed across the water. "What do you say?" Harlan asked. "Want to make it interesting? Double or nothing?" Beckett said nothing. Linnea said nothing. They kept working. Harlan's smile faded. "Silent treatment," he said. "Fine. But when those walls come down and you two are freezing to death in your own rubble, do not come to my father's store looking for help. He does not extend credit to fools." He turned and walked away, his friends following, their laughter fading across the prairie. Mrs. Prudence Holloway did not come to the building site. She did not need to. She spread her opinions from behind the counter of her husband's dry goods store, where every woman in Millbrook stopped at least once a week. "Those poor children," she said, loud enough for everyone to hear. "No parents. no guidance. Building a house out of mud and straw like they are playing in a sandbox. Someone should stop them before they hurt themselves. She said it to Mrs. Lindgren, who said nothing back. She said it to Mrs. Thorne, who nodded sympathetically and adjusted her hat. She said it to Dorothea Marsh, who set down the bolt of fabric she had been examining and looked at Prudence Holloway with eyes that could have frozen water in midsummer. "I have seen those children work," Dorothea said. Her voice was quiet, but it carried through the entire store. "I have seen them dig clay from sunup to sundown. I have seen their hands bleed and watched them wrap them up and keep digging. Whatever they are building it with more courage than anyone in this store has shown in years." She picked up the fabric and turned toward the door. "Shame on you, Prudence," she said. "Shame on all of you." The store was very quiet after she left. Something happened on the 24th of October that changed everything. Tobias Marsh, Dorothea's 16-year-old son, had been helping Beckett dig a new pit for clay at the edge of the creek. The ground was soft there, undermined by water, and neither of them realized how soft, until Tobias took a step too close to the edge and the earth gave way beneath him. He went down fast, sliding into a pit that had suddenly become 7 feet deep, and the walls of the pit began to collapse around him as he fell. Beckett heard him cry out, heard the sound of earth sliding, and then there was silence. He moved without thinking. He grabbed a rope from the wagon, tied it around a fence post, and lowered himself into the pit before the walls finished falling. Tobias was at the bottom, half buried in loose clay, his face pale and his breath coming in short gasps. "I have you," Beckett said. He dug with his hands, clawing at the clay until he could get his arms under Tobias's shoulders. "Do not move. I have you." It took 20 minutes to get them both out. By the time they reached the surface, Linnea had run to the Marsh house, and Dorothea was waiting at the edge of the pit, with her face white and her hands shaking. She said nothing when she saw her son alive and breathing. She simply wrapped her arms around him and held on, and over his shoulder she looked at Beckett, with something in her eyes that was beyond gratitude, beyond relief, beyond any word Beckett knew. From that day forward, Dorothea Marsh let them buy supplies on credit with no questions asked. From that day forward, she came to the building site herself, bringing food and coffee and bandages, staying until dark. From that day forward, she was not just a sympathizer. She was one of them. Warren Aldridge came back on the 21st of October. He rode up in the middle of the afternoon when 6 of them were on the roof laying cedar shingles in the staggered pattern Silas had taught them. Beckett and Linnea were there, and Silas and Tobias Marsh, who had recovered completely and refused to stay away, and Magnus Lindgren and his wife Elspeth, who had not missed a day since she recognized the straw slip technique from her grandmother's stories. Aldridge sat his horse at the edge of the track and watched for 10 minutes without speaking. $120 for the section, he finally called up. "I am being generous on account of the labor you have put in. Labor that is going to be wasted." Beckett stood at the edge of the roof and looked down at him. "That frame is going to come down in the first hard wind," Aldridge said. "The clay in your walls is going to freeze and crack before Christmas, just like the doctor said. You are wasting good people's time. And when this building fails, I will buy the land for the price of firewood." Linnea walked to the edge of the roof and stood beside her brother. Her hands were wrapped in bandages. Her auburn hair had come loose from its pins, and her gray eyes were steady as stone. "No thank you, Mr. Aldridge," she said. "We will not be selling." Aldridge looked at her for a long moment. Something flickered in his eyes that might have been surprise, or might have been respect, or might have been something else entirely. "You were warned," he said. "Remember that." He turned his horse and rode south without looking back. The walls were rising, the roof was taking shape, and somewhere out over the prairie, something was building that would test every stone, every board, every ounce of faith they had poured into this place. "Stay with us." They finished the walls on the 28th of October. It had taken 41 days, 400 pounds of straw, 2 tons of clay, and more hours of labor than Beckett could count. His hands had blistered and healed and blistered again. Linnea's shoulders ached constantly, a deep, bone-tired ache that did not go away even when she slept. Silas had worked beside them every day, adjusting, correcting, teaching, until his teaching became unnecessary, because they had learned. The building that rose from the foundation was not the same building that had stood there before. It was better. The outer frame, the charred oak skeleton that Warren Aldridge had wanted to tear down, still stood where it had always stood. But inside it, separated by a gap of 10 inches, rose a new frame of fresh cedar. The space between them was packed solid with straw slip, tamped down layer by layer, dried slowly in the autumn air. The roof was cedar shakes laid in overlapping rows, 3 layers deep, watertight and windtight. Silas had insisted on the extra layer. In Norway, he said, they lay their roofs thick enough to hold a foot of snow without creaking. "We do the same here." The chimney had been rebuilt from the foundation up, the old granite stones cleaned and repointed, the flue lined with clay to prevent sparks from escaping into the walls. The hearth was wide enough for a fire that could heat the entire building, and the iron stove Dorothea Marsh had donated from her own storeroom sat ready to receive its first load of wood. They lit that first fire on the evening of the 28th. Beckett struck the match and touched it to the kindling, and the fire caught and grew, orange and yellow, and finally a steady red that painted the new walls with warmth. The straw slip took the heat and held it, distributed it, returned it to the air inside the building like a hand returning a gift. Outside, it was 32 degrees and dropping. Inside, within an hour, it was 58 degrees and rising. Silas put his weathered hand flat against the inside wall and held it there and closed his eyes. He stayed that way for a long moment, feeling something that no thermometer could measure. "Like a stone oven," he said finally. "Exactly like a stone oven. The way my father described it. The way his father described it before him." Linnea was standing by the window, looking out at the prairie. The sunset was painting the grass in shades of copper and gold, and the sky above was turning the deep purple that came before the stars. She was crying. She did not try to hide it. "We did it," she said. "We actually did it." Beckett put his arm around her shoulders, and she leaned into him, and Copper came and pressed against both their legs, and for a moment they were not orphans or pioneers or fools or anything else the world had called them. They were family. They were home. On the morning of November 1st, Silas Brennan collapsed. He had been showing Beckett how to bank a fire for overnight burning, demonstrating the arrangement of logs and ash that would keep coals alive until morning. He finished the demonstration, stood up, and then his face went gray, and he put his hand on his chest and crumpled like a puppet whose strings had been cut. Beckett caught him before he hit the floor. Linnea ran for the wagon. Copper barked, sharp and high, a sound Beckett had never heard him make before, a sound of alarm that echoed off the new walls. They got Silas to Dr. Bellamy's office in Millbrook in less than an hour. Bellamy examined him behind a closed door, and when he came out, His face was careful in the way doctors' faces become when the news is not good. His heart, Bellamy said. The muscle is weakened. He cannot do physical labor anymore, not of any kind. If he tries, it will kill him. Linnea's hand found Beckett's and squeezed. He will recover? She asked. Bellamy adjusted his spectacles. He will live, he said, if he rests. If he stops pretending he is 30 years younger than he is. If someone makes sure he does not pick up another shovel or climb another ladder for the rest of his life. He looked at Beckett, and something in his expression had changed. The building is your responsibility now, he said. Whatever comes next, you will have to face it without him. They brought Silas back to the trading post because he refused to stay in Bellamy's clinic, and because there was nowhere else that was warm enough and quiet enough for him to heal. He lay on a cot by the fire with blankets piled around him, and copper stretched out beside him, and he watched Beckett and Linnea work with eyes that were tired, but still sharp. You know enough, he said. I taught you enough. The walls are done, the roof is done, the chimney is done. Whatever comes now, you can handle it. Beckett was not so sure. What if something breaks? He asked. What if we missed something? Silas smiled, a thin smile that cost him effort. Then you fix it, he said. That is what builders do. They build, and then they fix, and then they build again. It never ends, and it never should end, because a building is not a thing that is finished. It is a thing that is lived in, and living means change. He closed his eyes. You will do fine, he said. I believe in you. Now let me sleep. That night, copper would not settle. He paced the floor of the trading post, his claws clicking on the boards, his ears swiveling toward the windows. Every few minutes he would stop and stare in the same direction, northwest, toward the darkness where the sky met the prairie. Linnea watched him from her chair by the fire. Something is wrong, she said. Beckett looked up from the journal he had been reading, Uncle Elias's journal with its notes on building and weather and survival. He has been restless all day, he said. Maybe he senses Silas is sick. Linnea shook her head. That is not it, she said. Look at where he is looking, northwest. That is where the weather comes from. Beckett stood and walked to the window. The sky outside was clear, but the stars had a strange brightness to them, a sharpness that he had not seen before. The air that came through the crack around the window frame was cold, but it was a different kind of cold, a cold that seemed to be waiting for something. Elspeth Lindgren had come by that afternoon. She had stood outside the trading post and looked at the sky for a long time, and then she had come inside and found Linnea and taken her hands. I have seen this sky before, she said. In Sweden, in 1856, the year of the great ice, the sky looked just like this the day before the storm came. Her green eyes were serious. Prepare, she said. Whatever you have, whatever you need, make sure it is inside these walls before tomorrow night. The storm is coming, and it will not be gentle. The building was complete. But the true test was only hours away. Everything Beckett and Linnea had built, everything Silas had taught them, everything their uncle had dreamed of, was about to face a storm that would break everything else in its path. Would the walls hold? The answer was coming. Stay with us. The ice storm came on November 2nd, 1889. It began in the hour before dawn, when the sky was still dark and the stars were still visible. The first sound was a hiss, soft and continuous, like sand being poured from a great height. Then came a sharper sound underneath, the sound of every blade of grass on the prairie being coated in glass. Beckett woke to that sound and knew immediately what it was. He had heard ice storms before in Chicago, the rattle of frozen rain against window glass. But this was different. This was rain that froze before it hit the ground. Rain that turned the air itself into something solid. He got up and went to the window. The world outside was disappearing behind a curtain of white. But it was not snow. It was water, falling and freezing, coating everything it touched. By sunrise, the whole county was encased. Every fence wire was wrapped in ice an inch thick. Every branch of every cottonwood tree was bowed under the weight. Every blade of tall grass stood rigid, frozen in place, and the wind that had been quiet at dawn began to build. The temperature dropped. It dropped through the 20s and the teens and the single digits, and it kept dropping. By noon, it was 5 below zero. By sunset, it was 15 below. By midnight, it was 25 below and falling. The wind rose with the cold. It came from the northwest, howling across the open prairie with nothing to stop it, nothing to slow it down. It pushed the frozen rain sideways, coating the windward side of every building, every tree, every fence, while the leeward side stayed momentarily clear. The ice accumulated. It accumulated an inch in the first hour, 2 inches by noon, 4 inches by sunset. It accumulated on roofs and walls and windows, and the weight of it began to break things. The first building to fail was the Lindgren barn, 3 miles west. The roof collapsed at 2 in the afternoon under the weight of the ice, and 4 cattle were killed instantly. Magnus and his sons barely got the other animals out before the walls followed the roof. They came to the trading post an hour later, 8 people and 6 surviving cattle, covered in ice and shaking so hard they could barely walk. "Come in," Linnea said. She held the door open wide, and the warmth poured out into the frozen air, and Magnus Lindgren stepped inside and stopped moving for a moment, because he could not believe what he was feeling. "It is warm," he said. His voice was shaking, and not just from the cold. "It is actually warm in here." 54 degrees, Beckett said. "The same as it was yesterday. The same as it will be tomorrow." Magnus looked at the walls, at the ceiling, at the fire burning steadily in the stove. "How is this possible?" he asked. Beckett did not answer. He did not need to. The building was answering for him. The storm continued through the night and into the next day. On the second day, the roof of the Methodist church collapsed. Reverend Crane and his family barely escaped, running through the frozen streets to the parsonage next door, which held for another hour before its roof gave way as well. They came to the trading post at dusk, 6 people, including Crane himself, who walked through the door with ice in his beard and his Bible clutched against his chest. He said nothing when he entered. He simply stood in the warmth and looked around at the walls and the fire and the people already gathered there, and something in his face shifted in a way that words could not describe. "Welcome," Linnea said. "There is room by the fire." Crane nodded. He did not speak. He found a place against the wall and sat down and closed his eyes, and his lips moved in what might have been prayer or might have been something else entirely. On the third day, Dr. Bellamy came. His clinic had flooded when the pipes froze and burst, and the medicines he had stored for 20 years were ruined, frozen solid in their bottles and jars. He came on foot because his horse had refused to leave the stable, walking 3 miles through ice and wind that cut through every layer of clothing he wore. His spectacles were coated with frost when he arrived. His hands were so cold, he could not grip the door handle. Tobias Marsh opened the door for him, and Bellamy stumbled inside and fell to his knees, and for a long moment he simply knelt there on the floor, feeling the warmth seep into his bones. "I was wrong," he said. His voice was barely a whisper. I was so terribly wrong. Linnea brought him a blanket. Dorothea brought him hot coffee. Silas, watching from his cot by the fire, said nothing at all. He simply nodded once and closed his eyes. On the fourth day, the temperature dropped to 42 below zero. Harlan Garrett lost 2 fingers to frostbite. He had gone outside to check on his father's horses just for 5 minutes, and when he came back inside, his right hand was white and senseless. Dr. Bellamy, working by firelight in the trading post, tried to save the fingers but could not. Harlan lay on a pallet near the fire, pale and silent, and he did not make jokes or bets or clever comments. He simply stared at his bandaged hand and said nothing. 23 people were in the trading post by then. 23 people and 6 cattle and 4 horses and a dog named Copper who had not stopped watching the door since the storm began. They shared blankets. They shared food. They took turns feeding the fire, the men on shifts, passing the job from one to the next without being asked. The women organized everything else: the cooking and the sleeping arrangements and the care of the injured and the sick. On the third night, something happened that no one who witnessed it ever forgot. Emma Thorne was 7 years old, the daughter of Marcus Thorne, the banker who had refused Beckett a loan and called the trading post a grave. She had not spoken since arriving at the shelter. Not a word, not a sound. She sat in the corner with her knees pulled to her chest and her eyes fixed on nothing, and no amount of coaxing from her mother or father could reach her. The cold had done something to her. The fear had done something. Whatever words she had known seemed to have frozen inside her, along with everything else. Copper noticed her before anyone else did. The old dog had been lying by the fire, conserving his warmth, but sometime in the late afternoon, he got up and walked across the room and sat down in front of Emma Thorne. He did not bark. He did not push. He simply sat there, looking at her with his amber eyes, patient and still. For a long time, nothing happened. Then Emma's hand moved. Slowly, carefully, like a bird testing a branch, her fingers reached out and touched the top of Copper's head. Copper leaned into her touch. He closed his eyes. He sighed the way dogs sigh when they are exactly where they want to be. And Emma Thorne spoke. "Can I keep petting him?" she whispered. Her voice was rusty from disuse. "Please, he is so warm." Linnea felt tears on her cheeks before she knew she was crying. Dorothea put her hand over her mouth. Even Marcus Thorne, who had called them fools and grave builders, turned away so no one would see his face. "You can pet him as long as you want," Beckett said quietly. "He is good at keeping people warm." Emma did not let go of Copper for the rest of the night. She fell asleep with her arms around his neck and her face buried in his copper-colored fur, and Copper did not move, did not shift, did not do anything that might disturb her. He stayed exactly where he was needed. He had always been good at that. On the fourth night, in the darkest hours before dawn, a different kind of cry filled the trading post. Ingrid Eriksson had been 8 months pregnant when the storm hit. Her husband had carried her through the ice to the shelter, and she had spent 3 days lying on a pallet near the fire, praying that the baby would wait. The baby did not wait. Willa Thornwood, the nurse who had saved Silas's life and who had tended the sick throughout the storm, delivered him by firelight, with Dorothea holding Ingrid's hand and Elspeth murmuring old Swedish prayers and the whole building holding its breath. Outside, the wind still howled and the ice still fell, but inside, a new life was fighting its way into the world. He was born at 3:47 in the morning, small and red-faced and furious at being disturbed. His cry was thin at first, then stronger, then loud enough to wake everyone who had managed to sleep. No one complained about being woken. They named him Elias, after the man who had dreamed of this building and never lived to see it rebuilt. Elias Eriksson, born in a shelter during a storm, surrounded by people who would remember this moment for the rest of their lives. When Beckett held him for the first time, the baby stopped crying and looked up at him with eyes that had not yet decided what color they would be. "Welcome to the world," Beckett said quietly. "You picked a hell of a night to arrive." The baby yawned, unimpressed, and went to sleep in his arms. Someone had brought a violin. On the fourth night, after the baby was born, and after Emma Thorne had finally fallen asleep with copper, a man named Eriksson played soft airs while the others listened. The music drifted through the warm air like something from another world, something that belonged to summer and sunshine and places where the wind did not try to kill you. Elspeth Lindgren told stories. She sat in the corner with the children gathered around her and told them tales from the old country, stories of trolls and heroes and winters that lasted for years. The children listened with wide eyes, and for a little while they forgot about the storm outside. Beckett stood by the window and watched the ice fall. He could not see more than 10 feet through the white curtain of the storm. The prairie had disappeared. The sky had disappeared. There was only the ice and the wind and the small circle of warmth behind him, the warmth that was keeping everyone alive. His uncle had dreamed of this building. His uncle had imagined a place where people could gather and survive and help each other through the worst that the prairie could throw at them. And now it was real. Now it was filled with people who had come as strangers and were becoming something else. Something that did not have a name yet, but felt like the beginning of a community. On the afternoon of the fourth day, a wagon appeared through the storm. Beckett saw it first, a dark shape moving slowly through the white, pulled by 2 horses that were shivering so hard their legs seemed to blur. The wagon stopped at the edge of the track, and a figure climbed down from the seat. And even through the ice and wind, Beckett recognized him. Warren Aldridge. He was carrying someone in his arms, his wife, limp and unmoving, wrapped in blankets that were already stiff with ice. Behind him, climbing down from the wagon bed, were 2 young women who must have been his daughters, and an older woman who moved like she was not sure her legs would hold her. The roof of the Aldridge house had collapsed at 4 in the morning. The kitchen chimney had followed an hour later. Warren Aldridge, who had offered to buy this land for $75, who had called them fools and gravediggers, who had burned their uncle's building and let him die alone in a boarding house 60 miles away, was standing outside the door with his dying wife in his arms and nowhere else to go. Linnea walked to the door. She stood there for a moment with her hand on the latch, and Beckett could see her shoulders rise and fall with a long breath. He knew what she was thinking. He knew what choice she was making. She opened the door. The warmth poured out into the frozen air, and Warren Aldridge stood in the doorway with his wife in his arms. And for the first time since Beckett had met him, the older man had nothing to say. Linnea looked him in the eyes. "Come in, Mr. Aldridge," she said. "No one should die for pride." That moment changed everything. Warren Aldridge carried his wife through the door and into the warmth, and Dr. Bellamy was there to take her, to examine her, to do what he could. The daughters and the mother-in-law followed, shaking and silent, and someone found them blankets and places by the fire. Aldridge did not sit down. He stood in the middle of the room and looked around at the walls and the ceiling and the fire, and his face went through expressions that Beckett could not name. "This is impossible," he said. His voice was rough, broken. This should not exist. Silas looked at him from across the room. The old man lifted one weathered hand and gestured at the warm walls around them, letting the building speak for itself. Aldridge looked at Silas. Then he looked at Beckett. Then he looked at Linnea, who had closed the door and was standing with her arms crossed, watching him. He did not apologize. He did not thank them. He simply stood there, and something in him seemed to collapse inward, something that had been holding him up for a long time. Then he walked to the wall farthest from the fire and sat down on the floor with his back against the straw slip, and he closed his eyes and did not open them again for a long time. The storm broke on the 7th of November. The sun rose on a world that had been remade. Every surface was coated in ice, inches thick, glittering in the morning light like a kingdom made of glass. The temperature was still 15 below zero, but the wind had stopped, and the sky was clear, and the worst was over. 58 people walked out of the trading post that morning. 57 had walked in. One had been born inside, his first breath drawn in warmth while the world outside tried to freeze everything it touched. They stood in the frozen yard and looked around at the devastation. Roofs had collapsed across the county. Barns had fallen. Trees had shattered under the weight of the ice. The road to Millbrook was blocked by fallen timber, and the creek was frozen solid from bank to bank. But they were alive. Every one of them was alive. 58 people had survived the worst ice storm in the county's history, sheltered by walls that everyone had said would fail. But the story was not over. What came next would change Millbrook forever, and it began with a confession that no one expected. Stay with us. The counting began that afternoon. Men went out in groups of 3 and 4, checking on neighbors who had not made it to the trading post, searching through the wreckage of collapsed buildings, looking for anyone who might still be alive. What they found was not good. 43 people had died in Cottonwood County during the 5 days of the storm. Most of them had frozen in their homes when their fires went out, and they could not get more wood. Some had tried to walk to safety and collapsed in the snow. Some had been crushed when roofs fell. The bodies would not be buried until spring. The ground was too frozen, too hard, too deep in ice for any shovel to break. They would wait in makeshift morgues, in barns that still stood, in sheds that had survived, until the thaw came and the earth could receive them. Dr. Bellamy made his rounds with a notebook, recording names and causes of death, doing the grim work that fell to him because there was no one else to do it. His hands shook as he wrote, and not from the cold. Reverend Crane held services in the trading post on the first Sunday after the storm. He stood by the fire with his Bible in his hands and spoke words of comfort that seemed inadequate to the scale of the loss. But the people listened, and some of them wept, and something like peace settled over the room. He did not mention pagan knowledge. He did not speak of the wisdom of men who did not know God. He simply prayed, and his prayers were for the living as much as the dead. Warren Aldridge came to find Beckett on the morning of the 9th day. The sky was clear, and the temperature had risen to 10 degrees above zero, which felt almost warm after what they had endured. Aldridge's wife was recovering slowly, fed broth and kept warm by the fire, attended by women who had every reason to turn their backs on her husband. Beckett was outside, checking the foundation for any damage from the storm, when Aldridge approached. The older man walked slowly, like someone carrying a weight that was not visible. He stopped a few feet away and stood in silence for a long moment. "I need to tell you something," he said finally. Beckett straightened and faced him. Aldridge's jaw worked, as if the words were stuck somewhere, and he was trying to force them out. 3 years ago, he said. "The fire that destroyed this building. They said it was lightning." "I know," Beckett said. "My uncle wrote about it in his journal." Aldridge's face changed. Something flickered in his eyes that might have been fear. What did he write? Beckett did not look away. He wrote that there was no storm that night. He wrote that he found coal oil on the stones by the east window. He wrote that you had been trying to buy this land for 2 years and that he had refused. Aldridge stood very still. "He wrote that he thought you burned it," Beckett said, "and that the burning is what killed him, even if it took 3 more years." The silence stretched between them, long and cold. Then Aldridge spoke, and his voice was different, emptied of everything except the truth. "He was right," he said. "I did it. I paid a man to do it. I told myself it was just a building, just some boards and nails, and that Elias would see sense and sell once it was gone. I told myself no one would get hurt." He looked at the trading post, at the walls that had saved his wife's life. "But Elias was inside," Aldridge said. "He was supposed to be in Mankato. He was always in Mankato on the 3rd Tuesday of the month, but that night he stayed, and he got out. But something broke in him. I saw it. I saw him after, and he was not the same man." His voice cracked. "He died because of me, because I wanted a road for my timber wagons, because I was too proud to find another way." Beckett felt something shift in his chest, something that was not quite anger and not quite forgiveness. "Why are you telling me this?" he asked. "Because I owe you the truth," Aldridge said. "Because you opened your door to me when you had every right to leave me in the cold. Because your sister looked me in the eye and said no one should die for pride. And I have been thinking about those words every minute since." He took a breath. "I cannot bring your uncle back. I cannot undo what I did. But I can tell you the truth, and I can spend the rest of my life trying to make it right." Beckett was silent for a long time. The wind blew across the frozen prairie, carrying the smell of ice and wood smoke, and something underneath that might have been the beginning of spring. "My uncle would have opened the door," Beckett said finally. "He would have let you in, just like Linnea did. He built this place to help people, all people, even the ones who did not deserve it." He met Aldridge's eyes. "I do not forgive you," he said. "Not yet. Maybe not ever, but I will not become you either. I will not let hate rot me from the inside the way it rotted you." He turned back to the foundation. "Go help the others," he said. "There is work to do." Aldridge did help. He worked alongside men who knew what he had done, men who had heard the confession that spread through the trading post within hours. He hauled timber and cleared roads and helped rebuild what the storm had destroyed, and he did not ask for thanks or recognition. His wife recovered fully by the end of November. His daughters stayed in the trading post for 2 weeks, helping with the cooking and the cleaning, before the Aldridge house was rebuilt and they could go home. Before he left, Aldridge made a proposal. He would donate the lumber to build an addition to the trading post, a proper room for a healer or nurse or anyone else who needed to stay. He would establish a fund to maintain the building, to pay for repairs and supplies and firewood. He would pay Willa Thornwood, the nurse who had saved Silas's life and who had tended the sick throughout the storm, a proper yearly wage to stay and serve the community. "I cannot erase what I did," he said, "but I can build something better." Beckett listened to the proposal. He looked at Linnea. He looked at Silas, who was sitting up now, growing stronger every day. Then he looked at Aldridge. "The room would be welcome," he said. "Mrs. Thornwood will decide about the wage herself. As for the rest," he paused, A hard mouth is a thing a man can put down when he chooses. I think you have chosen. Aldridge nodded slowly. Then he turned and walked out into the pale November sunlight, and something in the way he walked was different, like a man who had finally set down a weight he had been carrying for years. Spring came slowly to Cottonwood County. The ice melted in late March, revealing the damage that had been hidden all winter. Roofs that had seemed intact were found to be cracked and sagging. Foundations that had looked solid were discovered to be shifted and broken. The county spent April and May and most of June rebuilding what the storm had destroyed. But they did not rebuild the old way. 12 families came to the trading post that spring to learn the straw slip technique. Magnus Lindgren came first, and he brought his neighbors, and they brought their friends. Beckett taught them what Silas had taught him: the mixing of clay and straw, the packing of the wall cavity, the tamping and drying and finishing. Silas watched from his chair by the fire, offering advice when asked, correcting errors when he saw them. His heart was still weak, but his mind was sharp, and his knowledge flowed through Beckett to every builder who came to learn. By autumn, 8 new buildings in the county had been constructed with double walls and straw slip insulation. By the following spring, there were 20. By the time Beckett turned 25, there were over 50, and the technique had spread to neighboring counties and beyond. Linnea married Tobias Marsh in the spring of 1891, in a ceremony held inside the trading post, with the whole community gathered to witness. She wore a dress she had made herself, white cotton with lace at the collar, and Tobias looked at her like she was the only person in the room. They built a house on the Marsh property, a small house with double walls and straw slip insulation, warm in winter and cool in summer. They had 3 children in 4 years, 2 girls and a boy, and they named the boy Elias after the uncle Linnea had never really known but would never forget. Beckett married Willa Thornwood in the autumn of the same year. She was 32 then, widowed once already, practical and patient and unafraid of hard work. She moved into the trading post and made it her home, and her healing skills made it a place where people came not just for shelter, but for help. They had 2 children, both girls, born in the room that Warren Aldridge had paid to build. They named the first one Clara after Willa's mother, and the second one Elspeth after the old Swedish woman who had first recognized the straw slip technique and who had passed away quietly in her sleep the previous winter. Silas Brennan died on a February morning in 1893. He went peacefully, in his sleep, in the cot by the fire where he had spent so many hours teaching and watching and remembering. Copper was lying beside him when Beckett found him, the old dog's head resting on the old man's chest, keeping him warm even after the warmth had left. They buried Silas on the hill overlooking the trading post, in a spot he had chosen himself years earlier. From there you could see the building he had helped create, the walls he had taught them to build, the legacy he had passed on. The headstone read, Silas Brennan, 1821 to 1893. He built things that lasted. Copper died 8 years later, in 1901, old and gray and content. They buried him beside Silas, and the children of Millbrook put flowers on both graves every spring. The trading post served as a community shelter and gathering place for 52 years. Generations of families passed through its doors. Children learned to read by its fire. Weddings were celebrated beneath its charred oak beams. Funerals were mourned there too, when the weather was too harsh for the cemetery. In the worst winters, families still came for warmth, because the straw slip walls held their heat exactly the way Silas had said they would, exactly the way they had during the great ice storm of 1889. Beckett Whitmore lived to be 78 years old, He died in 1946, surrounded by his daughters and grandchildren and great-grandchildren in the small room off the back of the trading post that he had built for himself and Willa all those years ago. His last words, according to his oldest granddaughter, were these: "Tell them to check the chimney. Winter is coming." In 1941, the Millbrook Town Council met inside the trading post and voted unanimously to preserve the building as a historical landmark. They could have met anywhere, in the new town hall or the church or any of a dozen other buildings. But they met here, in the place that had saved their grandparents and great-grandparents, because some decisions deserve to be made in places that matter. The plaque they placed on the granite foundation the following spring read, in part, "The Whitmore Trading Post, built 1859, burned 1886, rebuilt 1889. During the Great Ice Storm of November 1889, this building sheltered 57 souls who arrived seeking refuge, witnessed the birth of one more, and saw all 58 walk out alive when the storm ended. They inherited ashes, they built shelter, and when the storm came, every one of them survived." In 1987, researchers from the University of Minnesota came to Millbrook to study the trading post as part of a project on traditional building techniques. They took core samples from the walls. They measured temperatures inside and outside over the course of a full winter. They calculated heat transfer rates and insulation values and all the other numbers that engineers use to describe what builders have always known by feel. Their findings confirmed what Silas Brennan had understood 100 years earlier. The straw slip walls achieved thermal efficiency comparable to modern insulation standards. The double-wall construction reduced heat loss by more than 60% compared to conventional single-wall buildings of the same era. Modern engineers studying traditional European building methods have confirmed that straw clay insulation can achieve thermal efficiency comparable to modern standards, and in some cases even exceed them. In scientific language, full of formulas and footnotes, they proved what Beckett and Linnea had proved with their hands and their sweat and their refusal to give up. The old knowledge worked. It had always worked. If you visit Millbrook today, you can still see the trading post standing on its granite foundation, the charred oak beams still visible above the cedar inner walls, the chimney still rising against the prairie sky. The straw slip is still in the walls. After more than 130 years, it is still holding heat, still doing what Silas Brennan promised it would do. And if you ask the old-timers why the building has 2 walls instead of 1, they will smile the way their grandparents smiled, and their great-grandparents before them. Because, they will say, a young man once listened to an old man who walked 8 miles to teach him something he could not explain any other way but by doing. Because knowledge that saves lives is worth any price. Because when the storm comes, and the storm always comes, the only thing that matters is whether your walls will hold. This story is part of our series on the wisdom of the past. If it stayed with you, subscribe, so you will not miss the next one. We share stories like this every week. Stories of ordinary people who proved that the old ways still work. Stories of courage and community and walls that hold. Thank you for listening. We will see you in the next one. The end.